written law of God. Look at it. It's a pack of lies from the lying pen of scribes. Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8.
As a hostage in Beirut, I was a victim of a very ancient struggle over the ownership of the land of Israel.
I was kept largely in isolation for 5 years and given a Bible to read. I read it through twice. I had time. This was the book on which the whole thing was based. The book that seemed to explain Israel's claim to the land. And not surprisingly, since my release, I've been interested in just what kind of book this is. The British Museum is a great place for ancient civilizations, but not, it seems, for the Israelites.
Jonathan, having had a quick look around it, I don't see much that talks about the great history of ancient Israel. Where's that gone?
Well, it hasn't really gone anywhere, John. They're stories, and they're great stories. They're a part of the literary heritage of early Israel, but they're not stories which we can document archaeologically.
What does that mean? That the Old Testament is simply fiction? What about the Exodus from Egypt and invasion of Canaan?
We have no archaeological evidence for the invasion of Canaan.
The Israelites attacked Jericho and the walls miraculously collapsed.
Jericho was not defended by city walls at that time.
They slaughtered the inhabitants, then went on to do the same at other cities.
Many of the cities mentioned were not even occupied at the time.
And they took over the land of Canaan.
The Israelites were, in my opinion, they were Canaanites.
Really?
I've come to Israel to try to find out. The Old Testament says the Israelites conquered this land and created a great kingdom, destroying idol worship. Did the walls of Jericho fall before them in a miracle? Or have people been at war for thousands of years because they believe a fairy story?
I'm at the River Jordan. This is where the Israelites began to take over their promised land, according to the Bible. The Israelites may have had a hard time getting here to the River Jordan, but I'm not sure it was as difficult for them as it is for the modern traveler.
The river is the Israeli-Jordanian border, and that request is backed by force. If there was such a sign 3,200 years ago, the Israelites apparently ignored it.
They had just entered the land for the first time since leaving Egypt. Just as the Red Sea parted to let them out, so the River Jordan stopped its flow to let them in. It doesn't look much of an obstacle today, but in times of flood it can be the mighty river indeed. According to the book of Joshua, the miracles had only just begun. They went to Jericho.
Land of milk and honey? That's not a very good description of the Jordan Valley. Until you come to Jericho, the largest oasis in the Middle East. The modern city sprawls around the edge of the ancient one, which is just a huge mound of earth savaged by archaeologists digging into its history, checking up on whether the Israelites really did reduce a great city to dust.
On the seventh day they rose at dawn and marched 7 times round the city. The 7th time the priests blew the trumpets. Joshua said to the army, "Shout, the Lord hath given you the city." The army heard the trumpet sound, and they raised a great shout, and down fell the walls.
In the 1930s, John Garstang dug a hole in the mound which had once been ancient Jericho. And he declared that at the time of Joshua, Jericho was a walled city. He had found the walls, and he had found that suddenly, cataclysmically, the walls had collapsed. The Bible story was true. Bill Deaver is one of the many archaeologists now rewriting this history.
Jericho nowadays is regarded as one of the great scandals of biblical archaeology, where we really went wrong. We're looking here at the city wall of the late 3rd millennium BC, which was destroyed about 2300. This is the wall that John Garstang, working for the British in the 20s and 30s, identified as Joshua's wall, and he thought that the destruction was the destruction described in the book of Joshua, so he was obviously influenced by the biblical story.
As were lots of other people. Jericho became virtually a site of pilgrimage, the place where you could see the truth of a miracle. But then came a new excavation.
This is a deep trench on the west side of the mound that Dame Kathleen Kenyon cut in the 50s. What Kenyon did was to show that the wall was in fact built and destroyed 1,000 years before Joshua's time.
According to Kenyon, Jericho was undefended and abandoned by the time of Joshua. Garstang had misstated his wall by 1,000 years. Rather a big mistake.
So what was it that made Garstang think that this was the wall that Joshua destroyed?
Well, he may have been influenced already by the biblical story. He may have been influenced by his backers. They were evangelical, conservative Christian businessmen, and they probably had a certain result they desired.
How do you date a wall in a mound of compressed dust? To find out how Kenyon could be so sure, I visited another ancient city mound where archaeologists are sorting out what it contains. This is Tel Rahov.
The name Tel means accumulation of ancient cities one on top of the other. In the Middle East in general, they used to build their settlement sites one on top of the other. In this particular section, for example, we excavated almost 10 different cities, one on top of the other. And you can see in this section, a classic section through a mound, and we are standing now on one of the lowest one. In fact, it's not the lowest, we have even earlier. But this one dates from the 13th century BC. It should be the time of Moses, the Exodus.
Wow.
The people who lived here in this country during that time were Canaanites.
Yeah.
Every city left about 1 meter of debris. Yeah? So here you can see another brick wall, here one, here, and here, with a nice stone foundation.
Yeah.
And this is dated to the 12th century BC.
So would that be Joshua's time?
This will be more or less the time of Joshua.
Okay, then up another level. And so this is still 12th here?
12th century.
Okay.
Right. You can see here mud bricks. You see the mud bricks?
Yes, God,
You
very
see?
plain.
Very clear. And on top of these mud bricks, you have stone foundation.
Yeah.
On top of the stone foundation, again, there were mud bricks. So we have here two strata. A building that
Yeah.
was destroyed and rebuilt.
Yeah.
These are all dated to the 11th century BC.
So yet another 100 years up on here.
Yeah.
Okay.
We are in the 11th century, more or less the time of the judges. Okay?
It's an amazing spin through biblical history,
Up
isn't
in
it?
the ladder of time.
Yes, indeed.
And you can see how those tales were created. You can see that these people just threw rubbish into the street. They didn't have a municipality, you know, taking the rubbish out of the city. So you have here layers and layers and layers and layers
But that's
and layers of
incredible.
accumulation just from few dozens years, perhaps, maybe less than a century.
The rubbish includes so much broken pottery that you get the impression that every night in Canaan was party night, smashing the plates and bowls. But the design of pottery changes over time, and that's how each level can be dated. So every afternoon, the volunteers have to sit down and clean up every piece of broken pottery they've found.
Can you identify them yet?
The indicative pieces are ones that can actually tell if there's something, such as that rim there, that may be a base
So you've got
or
something like
a
that
top.
that helps, yeah?
Right, that's indicative of the type of pottery that it came from, the pot or whatever. It may be a chalice or something. We
Do you
don't-
spend sort of much of every afternoon washing these flat body shards with this?
Oh yeah, yeah. We pick them up in the early morning, and we wash them in the afternoon, and then the next morning we watch them dump out the ones that we can't use, so that we
Spend all
wash.
morning digging them and then they throw them away again.
Yeah, exactly.
That's good. Well, how accurate can you get date-wise from looking at the pottery shards?
We know already, even from a rim such as this, what the whole vessel looks like. And of course, the vessel as a whole is very typical of the period. But if you only have bits and pieces, usually the rim can tell you the most, rather than such a body shirt as this that could really belong to any time in the 9th century, 8th century or so.
Jericho is a tell just like Rehoboth. It's the accumulated rubbish from thousands of years of mud brick houses. A process that's still going on today, as the mud brick homes of Palestinian refugees are bulldozed within sight of the ancient city. And from the rubbish found in the remains, each level of occupation can be dated. Now there's a new excavation going on at Jericho. Biblical stories can be roughly dated because the Bible tells a continuous tale that includes known and dated events. To find traces of Joshua, we should be looking at rubbish from the 13th or 12th century BC. Trouble is, Hamdan Taha can't find any.
We are standing on a mud brick structure dating back to circa 1600 before Christ. And as you see, this is the surface of the till.
Yeah.
So no occupation took place after the abandonment of the site at the end of the 16th century. There is nothing, at least from archaeological results, to indicate that the site was inhabited when Joshua came to the site according to the biblical legend.
But the Palestinian Authority in charge of this dig also needs tourists. So they have not put up any notices saying, no miracles happened here.
It's marvellous to come all the way from Australia and to stand on the spot that they say is the site of Jericho of the Old Testament, and to look down across the Jordan River and to just think of the children of Israel coming and marching around that city. It's very soul satisfying.
And is it something you actually sort of visualise, knowing the text very well? You imagine the hordes of people coming across the river?
I can see it in my mind, yes, yeah. And standing on the tell, it's just incredible to think that that actually happened.
In the 13th century, where we would now date the Israelite exodus and conquest, if any, there is no occupation here at all. I always say to people, if you want a miracle, here's your miracle. Joshua destroyed a site that wasn't even there. Today, almost all scholars, both biblical scholars and archaeologists, accept the fact that Jericho cannot have been destroyed by the incoming Israelites. Something is wrong with the story.
As the archaeological picture of Jericho has been revised, the whole connection with biblical history has been broken. Why have things changed? A number of archaeologists told me that the results you get depend on who is doing the digging.
You see, in the 30s, most archaeologists working here in Israel were not archaeologists at all, not professionals. They were mostly clerics or theologians who came here, and their main aim was to look for the Israelite conquest, and they were looking everything through the biblical prism. Now, at the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s, right around the years of the independence of Israel, the archaeology of Israel turned to be a nationalistic archaeology.
In place of theologians with a spade in one hand and a Bible in the other, biblical sites were now being dug up by Israeli army veterans. Spade in one hand, Bible in the other, and some machine gun over the shoulder.
There were a lot of religious people, there were secular people, but for them, archaeology and whatever came from the spade was the proof of the connection between modern Israel and ancient Israel. With the Prime Minister, Ben-Gurion, he had meetings at his home with all these former generals and now archaeologists that, and the books that they were interested were the books of Joshua, the books of Judges, the books that showed how the Israelites came to be in their own land.
Zionism, the idea that Jews should move to Palestine and rebuild their lost country, created the State of Israel. The development of archaeology in this area goes hand in glove with politics. There is now a Palestinian Department of Antiquities responsible for the excavations at Jericho. Biblical Jericho has become Palestinian Tel el-Sultan. And instead of supporting Israel's special claim to the land, archaeologists now seem to be denying it. After all, why is this a Jewish state if this is not the promised land of the Old Testament? The book of Joshua names 12 cities where the Israelites killed all the Canaanites. But today's archaeologists say that 11 of the 12 were either uninhabited or undamaged. And with the new archaeology comes a new version of history.
The Israelites never were in Egypt. They never came from abroad. This whole chain of events is broken, is not a historical one. It's a later legend, reconstruction of an ancient history by sometimes during the 7th century, which never happened.
Zev Herzog works in Tel Aviv, a modern city built on virgin land with no biblical foundations. Home to a lot of people who prefer religious issues to take a back seat.
Well, this could be the nightlife of any big city, but I'm in Israel on the evening of a major religious festival. This is Tel Aviv, and it could be anywhere. And that's the big difference between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. It's the same holiday in Jerusalem, and I've come looking for the busy social life of the city. This is supposed to be it. But there's not a lot happening.
Tel Aviv plays, Jerusalem prays. And this is reflected in a political struggle over how to achieve peace. Secular Israelis may want to exchange biblical land for peace, while many Orthodox Jews call that betrayal. That's why Zev Herzog wanted people to know that the whole story of the Exodus and conquest seems to be untrue.
Well, I believe that this development contribute very nicely to the progress and the process of Israel into modern state, this Israeli society into more enlightened community, freed from messianic and strong religious beliefs, and being part of the modern world, as I wish it to be.
But when a national newspaper carried an article by him saying that the Israelites did not arrive from Egypt, he alarmed many Israelis who have no religious belief, as he was told by one government official.
He said that once he read this article, and with my statement that there was no Exodus, that we did not came from Egypt, he couldn't sleep for 3 days. And he's a secular person, and he's has a position in the Ministry of Education.
Zev Herzog hoped that secular people would find the news story helpful, but the emotional and political significance of saying the Exodus and conquest is a fairy story worries even secular politicians in Israel's parliament.
But I'm defending the Bible exactly because I'm not religious. I don't think that the archaeologist who is doing this in order to give somebody a reason to destroy us. But nevertheless, he's providing ammunition against us. Of course, the Bible is our mythology, even if you are not religious. And therefore, people want to diminish the stature of the Bible based on archaeological nitty-gritty, are really aiming to destroy the justification of the Zionist existence of the Jews in Israel nowadays.
A week after Herzog published his article, I saw in The Spectator a headline, "Israeli archaeologists undermine Israel's territorial claims." Definitely we are talking here, or this has political repercussions, no question. Unfortunately, we don't want it. I don't want it. I don't think that archaeology and politics should go together, but inevitably they do.
Funnily enough, it's secular people who are most likely to be upset by this challenge to biblical history. This is the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, where the Bible is the stuff of daily life. What does an Orthodox rabbi think of what Herzog is saying?
Well, I'm not an archaeologist, but my understanding is that even among the archaeologists there are differences of opinion. I think that it doesn't really make a difference to me, not because I'm a closed-minded person, because I've got my views set, but rather because I have a document. What they haven't yet found in the ground, they haven't yet found in the ground. It doesn't mean that tomorrow they won't find something else in the ground that'll put them on the right track.
The faithful can simply say that archaeologists haven't found things yet and haven't understood what they have found. That's the nature of faith. And the evidence about Joshua is not entirely one way. 11 of the 12 cities he is said to have captured were uninhabited or undamaged. But the 12th? Hatzor was the only city Joshua is said to have burned to the ground.
But as for the cities that stood still in their strength, Israel burned none of them save Hatzor only. That did Joshua burn.
This palace came to an end in a terrible fire, signs of which you can see everywhere. For example, the stairs, which have exploded, basalt, exploded to millions of pieces. Look at this wall here. See all this charcoal, all this burnt mud brick, all those vitrified mud brick over there. All this is really, really intense fire. The entire floor here, not only the walls had wood in them, the ceiling, of course, and the floors as well, which is rather unusual. And we find these pieces of charcoal. Actually, we had planks of 80 by 60 centimeters. The entire floor was a wooden floor, you know, like in Versailles or what have you. So it was a real, unusual, the mother of all destructions, okay? A real destruction.
Do you know when Hatzor was destroyed, and could it have been by Joshua?
Wow.
It's a big question, though.
It's one of the very, very big questions. Of course, it is not necessarily so as in Joshua, but it's also not necessarily not so. We have to wait and see until we get something more concrete. Let's keep our minds open and not exclude automatically the possibility as we have it in the Old Testament in its entirety.
But there must be something wrong with the biblical story. I'm now finding out that when the Israelites are supposed to have escaped from Egypt and entered Canaan, Canaan was ruled by Pharaoh. It doesn't say that in the Bible. This is Aphek, a military center near Tel Aviv. At the time of the story of the Exodus, in the 13th century BC, this was an Egyptian garrison.
The Egyptians are not mentioned at all in the story, and that is one of the best clues, if you wish, for the fact that the story does not describe a real-time reality of the 13th century BC, because if there was a prominent element in Canaan in the 13th century BC, at the time of the great Ramses II, that element was the Egyptian administration.
This building was the Egyptian HQ.
From the 15th century to the 12th century BC, during the 3 centuries, Egypt controlled Canaan, and Canaan was a province of Egypt with Egyptian administrators living in Canaan and stationed in several places, including this one.
So there would have been no point in leaving Egypt. There is no evidence that Joshua conquered this land. Mind you, there's no archaeological evidence that William the Conqueror took over England in 1066. But then the Bible also says that the Israelites uniquely believed in one single God. And yet there is compelling evidence that they worshipped a goddess as well.
Because if the Israelites believed in one invisible God, what were these little ladies doing in all their homes?
Whatever happened to Mrs. God? And just when did the Bible put women in their place? That's for next week.
The law of God. Look at it. It's a pack of lies from the lying pen of scribes. Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8.
אין מה לעשות נשים בין הגברים.
Speak English.
לדבר עברית? לא, אין לך מדינה פה.
This was going to be trickier than I'd expected. This is the Western Wall in Jerusalem. a surviving trace of the temple of 2,000 years ago. This is now a plaza divided into male and female sections. Traditionally, Jewish men pray out loud here, but women are not allowed to. Hence the riot.
It is forbidden for men to hear a woman's voice raised in song, and to do it in a way which is sticking it in the faces of people who have observed it and died for it and lived that way since God given it to us over 3,000 years ago, is offensive to these people, and that is why they're here making this noise.
If we look at Miriam, the prophet, she would have been in administrative detention today for what she has done. She's taken the drum, she started dancing and singing in a holy place. God forbid, we didn't even try to do that. She would have been in jail today.
It seems that the Old Testament has had some serious editing. We don't even know why Moses' sister Miriam is called a prophet. None of her prophecies have been included. The religions based on biblical history, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, are always said to be male-dominated religions. But there seems to be evidence that the religion of ancient Israel was very different.
There's certainly one mass of evidence that suggests the Bible does not accurately describe the religion of the Israelites. It seems pretty clear that throughout the time of the Old Testament, they did not worship just one God.
The commonest religious objects found in excavations throughout Israel turn out to be these figurines, which are, to put it bluntly, idols. I was given a Bible when I was held hostage in Lebanon. There wasn't much else to read. My captors gave me the King James Version, which I'm now discovering can be a bit misleading. The word God in the English version is often something else in the original.
The names used for God in the Bible are a strange mixture of things. It's as if they tried to assimilate all the different names from the local Canaanite culture and translate them into Jewish terms or Israelite terms. One of the most common names is Elohim, and that is a plural form of a word, where it's sometimes used to mean gods.
I find this a bit surprising. The opening sentence of the Bible is one of the best-known statements in the world. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But in fact, the Hebrew word used for God is Elohim, which turns out to be plural. The grammar is very unclear. It says, the gods, he created the heavens and the earth. Why would it say that?
We know now there were several gods, in particular a dominant female deity who is named Asherah. That is the same name as the old Canaanite mother goddess in the years preceding Israel's origin in the land.
Asherah, the mother goddess, belongs in a very different kind of religion from the one we associate with the God of Israel.
She seems to have been the consort or the partner of the highest god in the pantheon. And she seems to have been worshipped widely. Most of the figurines we find emphasize fertility. They often have large breasts, there's pregnancy shown, nursing children shown. Those kinds of figurines would tell us that she is a fertility goddess.
There's precious little written evidence outside the Bible about religion in the days of the First Temple. The name of God in Hebrew is written YHVH. It was probably not pronounced Jehovah, but Yahweh. Only one object has been excavated in Jerusalem with that name. This silver amulet is from the 7th century BC. Words from the Old Testament were faintly visible. Yahweh, lift up his face to you and grant you peace. But was Yahweh the only God being worshipped? This little ivory object dates from the 8th century BC and says, belonging to the temple of someone ending in H. It could be Yahweh, but his female counterpart Asherah also ends with an H. Evidence that Israelites worshipped Yahweh and Asherah appears on this stone, which Bill Deaver discovered in 1968. Dating from the same period as the ivory, it asks for someone to be blessed by Yahweh and his Asherah. Bill was so shocked, he decided at first to keep it secret.
And when I first discovered that, I really didn't want to publish that as a young scholar. It was too controversial. But then in the 1970s, a second site was found by Israeli archaeologists, also 8th century BC, in the Sinai, and you have the same expression. Again, may X be blessed by Yahweh and his Asherah. The reference to Asherah is to the great goddess herself. So Yahweh did have a consort like all the other gods of the ancient Near East, at least in the minds of many Israelites.
The discovery that there was a Mrs. God, a female goddess, for the Israelites in Bible times sounds quite shocking.
I think for modern Jews and Christians, it sounds like a huge shock because we've always thought this religion was monotheistic back to Abraham. But it's almost ridiculous to suggest you had a single male god without a wife. How could you possibly guarantee fertility of crops and fertility of the land with a single person without a female partner? It's more ridiculous to assume that than not to accept the fact that Israel had the same kind of structure as everyone else.
The Bible does accuse the Israelites of often worshipping other people's gods, and Freud encouraged the view that ancient gods were based on sexual imagery.
There was really a theory, maybe beginning of the 20s already, that maybe the Canaanite cult was based on two elements. One masculine element, maybe represented by an erected stone or pillar, and the feminine object was a sacred tree, maybe. And so those two elements combined together in a worship place maybe really realized the idea of fertility, of the relation between man and wife, and that was a common idea.
Phallic standing stones as male gods, tree-like nature goddesses bursting with life. This was a popular idea in the early 20th century. There was never any proof that the Canaanites did worship this way, but in the excavation at Tel Rehov, they have just uncovered a sacred spot that fits the description nicely. The only trouble is, it is not Canaanite. It comes from a date when Tel Rehov was, according to Diana Edelman, in biblical Israel. This is Israelite.
Diana, what have we here?
Well, this is an altar from somewhere between about 800 and 900 BCE. Mm-hmm. The actual altar itself are these stones here, right, which are unworked, just piled. And then we have this row of 4 uprights, or at least 3 that are a little more upright, and this little low stone here. And these seem to be something which often is seen to represent a deity. Right. And if this is true, we might have 3 deities here, or possibly 4. Right. But who they are, we wouldn't necessarily be able to tell.
But if this is 1000 or later than that, after the United Monarchy, we're talking about seriously Israelite times, it suggests they're not worshipping one god, but a number of deities.
No, we're this is, we are in the time of the period of the Kingdom of Israel. In addition, there is a round hole here, which the excavators say had some wood fragments in it. And there is a prohibition in the book of Deuteronomy against erecting a pole for the worship of Asherah next to an altar for Yahweh.
In the days when archaeologists in Israel were funded by Christian evangelists or Zionist organizations, they didn't seem to find much evidence of Israelites with pagan gods. But the excavation at Tel Rehov is funded by a detective story writer.
I just came off the book tour in a week before we came over here. And sometimes, you know, you're stuck in a hotel room in Los Angeles and you can't believe in 1 week you're going to be eating dust and all this sweat, but it's what I look forward to all year.
Does the work here on the site help with your writing?
I actually write here during the project in the afternoons. And a couple of people in the last few days started talking to me about what they thought really bad guys would be like. And it's starting to turn in my head. And I'm going to use some of it, I think. It really sort of helped the last 2 days.
I suppose I'm also looking at all this as a sort of detective story, involving some kind of mystery and hidden evidence. For instance, if the Israelites were worshipping Canaanite gods, you might expect these pottery goddesses to be even more common in the older Canaanite strata. Well, there was one.
Every season we put the prize find from the previous season on our T-shirts. This T-shirt is decorated with a drawing of a clay pottery figurine found by us in '98 in this 10th century level. We call it our city 6, the 10th century level. It shows probably a fertility goddess. We call her Ashtart, the Ashtart figurine. She is very unusual. First of all, because we have very few figurines like this from 10th century context in this country. Most of them are later, from the 8th and 7th centuries. Very unusual.
So most of these figurines come not from the Canaanite period, but from the years when there were established kingdoms in Israel and Judah. They were not simply imitating the Canaanites, they were doing their own thing. We don't have any evidence for the story that the Israelites came here from Egypt and conquered the land. And there are no sources outside the Bible that mention the great kingdom ruled by David and Solomon from Jerusalem. But according to the Old Testament, by the 9th century, there was a northern kingdom called Israel, or Samaria, and a southern kingdom called Judah, and those we do know about from other sources. The Bible also stresses that the Israelites worshipped the old Canaanite gods and were punished for it. The Canaanites' chief god was El, and he was worshipped as a bull. The Israelites also used the word El for God, and this is a bull found at an Israelite site. But then the Bible actually says that when Solomon's kingdom split and Israel separated from Judah, the king of Israel set up bull figures for worship at his northern and southern borders. It's just that the Bible says he shouldn't have done it. According to the Bible, Israel was deviating from the tradition of worshipping one God, and Judah was keeping the faith much better. But did monotheism exist at all at that time? The answer may have been found at Tel Arad.
It's a kind of an ancient military base, but as we go in, I will show you the most important find there, which is probably, I would say, the only Judahite temple ever found.
The only one?
Only one. And the temple was built after the days of Solomon and David. And it went out of use probably in the days of Hezekiah, which is up to, let's say, 700 before the Common Era. We're going into this entranceway, and we are right now in the first part of the tree. The temple was 3 parts. Yeah. The first one is an open court, paved as you can see, and in the center of the court there is the altar, the offering altar. Animals were slaughtered here, and burnt offering were offered on top of the altar. And then as we approach into this house of the Lord, house of the God, most important part is, of course, the Holy of the Holies. Incense burners were on both sides of the staircase.
And what are those pillars at the back there?
These are standing stones. No idols, no figurines, nothing of this kind was found here. It's a culture, religion without icons, which very much fits of what we know about, let's say, the 10 Commandments, for example, that idols was absolutely banned from the Israelite culture. The temple is very much according to the line of description of the temple in Jerusalem. So this is it. The only temple that we have might be Yahwistic in practice.
But it might not. We may have been staring directly at evidence of polytheism, worship of several gods.
There were 2, if not 3, standing stones, carefully smoothed and dressed, which clearly are what the Bible means by a standing stone that represents the presence of a deity. And the fact that you have 2 or even 3, again, suggests polytheism.
In fact, even the Bible's description of Solomon's temple is hard to reconcile with a religion that has no idols. It's more like the temples of other religions in the area.
We're looking now at a bronze stand coming from Cyprus, from the end of the 2nd millennium. On it we can see a very typical Canaanite imagery of a combined animal, human and animal figure, which maybe represents some sort of creature like the cherubs, which we find in the Solomonic temple in Jerusalem.
The Bible says that cherubs were placed in the tabernacle and then in the Holy of Holies of the temple. And they didn't look like this. They were more like sphinxes.
Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image.
The Bible doesn't need to hide the fact that the Jerusalem temple's furniture contradicted the third commandment, but Diana Edelman believes that someone has altered the text to conceal the worship of the mother goddess.
There are about 40 references to Asherah, and yet when you look at those references, you don't know you're really talking about a goddess. And so the later biblical scribes wrote her out as a goddess. They disguised her presence in the text.
Apparently, when the hero Gideon is told in one story to destroy his family's shrine, the original instruction would have been,
throw down the altar of Baal and chop up Asherah.
But a scribe writing the book of Judges wrote,
throw down the altar of Baal and chop up the Asherah.
So simply by changing grammar, you would prevent anyone from reading the term Asherah as a proper name.
In the King James Version of the Bible, when the translator did not know what an Asherah was, the word disappeared altogether.
Throw down the altar of Baal and cut down the grove.
And there are a number of references that say that this word Asherah, the Asherah, was cut down or was burned. So one of the possible meanings that came out of that was either a grove of trees or simply a tree.
So there was a Hebrew goddess, and she has been hidden. When did this happen? The answer seems to be connected with the temple at Arad, because the archaeologists found that this temple had been shut down, sealed, and deliberately buried in the 8th century BC. And the Bible itself explains why. King Hezekiah in Jerusalem launched a violent attack on the religion of his people.
He took away the places of worship and smashed the images and dismembered the Asherah.
Arad, the temple that we're standing in, went out of use deliberately. It was not burnt, it was not destroyed. It was all covered with dust and sand deliberately by the people who get an order to do that. The standing stone was put aside, the incense burners were put on the flat side, and it was all covered and went out of use deliberately, slowly, with no big event, as a kind of an order to stop worshipping Yahweh in Tel Arad.
This was connected with a disaster further north. In 722 BC, the Assyrian army wiped the northern kingdom of Israel off the map. Judah had to choose between defiance or submission, as thousands of refugees fled south into Jerusalem. And there is clear evidence that Jerusalem suddenly began to become a large city.
The city extends itself to the west, to the northwest, tremendously, to what is today called the Jewish quarter inside the old city of Jerusalem. Yeah. To that part and down to the east, to the valley. So we have fortifications and houses, water installations or systems and other things. This is true. This is, of course, because the population grew there in the 8th century, and for several reasons. One of them is, first of all, that refugees came to Jerusalem.
According to the Book of Kings, King Hezekiah invited them to celebrate Passover there.
And Hezekiah undertakes to centralize religion, the first king to do so, in Jerusalem. So this seems to be a pretty major reform. And it says that he closed down these local sanctuaries, and he forbid them from worshiping with stone pillars and planting these Asherah trees.
A few years later, under King Josiah, the attack on Asherah was relaunched with even greater vigor.
And the king commanded the high priest to bring forth out of the temple of Yahweh all the vessels that were made for Baal and for the Asherah, and he burned them. And he brought the Asherah from the temple to the brook outside Jerusalem, and burned it and stamped it small to powder.
The prophet Jeremiah found there was tremendous resistance to this from many women.
We will not hearken unto thee, but we will burn incense unto the Queen of Heaven, and pour out drink offerings unto her, as we have done, we and our fathers, our kings and our princes, in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. For then we had plenty of victuals, and were well, and saw no evil.
Men suddenly washed their hands of the goddess as though this had been a cult for women.
Did we make our cakes to worship her, and pour out drink offerings unto her without our men?
According to the Bible, those women were deviants from traditional Israelite religion. Just as today, many Orthodox Jews regard women who demand to worship like men as deviants.
Let's be like that. Let's come and eat. We want to.
50 years ago, it's not 100 years ago, wasn't 200 years ago.
So it's a break with tradition you don't like?
Sure, it's not the way it's supposed to be.
We read from the Torah scroll, and some of us wear prayer shawls when we pray, and we sing aloud as a group, and that's what we want to be able to do at the wall itself.
These women are not returning to the old Hebrew goddess, but I'm being told that the text from which they are reading was rewritten to conceal her existence, and that a combination of digging into the ground and into the text reveals a new story of biblical history. In that new story, there is no conquest, no Joshua, no worship of a single god. And yet the text carries a feel of authentic experience which is hard to dismiss. It describes a dedication ceremony as soon as they entered the Promised Land, binding the children of Israel to the one and only jealous God who led them. It was held at a great altar constructed on Mount Ebal. And if that story is fiction, then what in the world is this? Next week, I'm going to try to find out.
God. Look at it. It's a pack of lies from the lying pen of scribes. Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8.
As a hostage in Beirut, I was a victim of an ancient conflict over the ownership of the land of Israel. While I was there, I read the Bible through twice, which gave me comfort in some ways, but left me with a lot of questions. This was the basic text of the struggle going on, and it seems rather important to find out if the bits that look like the real history of the Israelites and the Promised Land are actually true.
It's a search that leads to some of the most mysterious archaeological finds ever made. Scholars are arguing that the history of early Israel is a fairy story, and that means that this huge structure may belong in the world of myth, not reality. But I'll be coming to that later. What I've discovered so far is that there's something wrong with the story. No walls tumbled at Jericho in the 13th century BC, the time of Joshua. The city had been destroyed and abandoned centuries earlier. The only city that seems to have been destroyed in a way that connects with the Bible is at Hatzor.
And they smote all the souls that were therein with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was not any left to breathe. And Joshua burnt Hatzor with fire.
The archaeological record shows the fire, but what the Bible doesn't mention is that Canaan was ruled by Egypt at the time. And the Egyptian records say that Pharaoh Seti attacked Hatzor. If Joshua turned up there later, he may have missed the main event.
We know that Seti I, around 1300, destroyed Hatzor because he claims in a famous inscription having done so. Now, is this the end of Hatzor, the real fire of Hatzor, and centuries later the Israelites claimed the victory and said, we did it? It's a possibility.
We don't actually have any archaeological evidence for Joshua. We don't really have any archaeological evidence for a conquest in the way that it's depicted in the Bible. So they didn't come from Egypt in the Exodus as is depicted in the biblical narrative.
Unless they came from Egypt and settled peacefully. Although the book of Joshua describes the conquest of Canaan, another book of the Bible, the book of Judges, says something rather different.
If you read the book of Joshua and then read the following book, the book of Judges, it seems as if you're dealing with two very different histories of the same event. Joshua has this amazing sudden attack and everything is conquered and distributed. In Judges, they're up in the hill country and they can't get down to the plains because there's too many military obstacles in the way.
Israel consists of a flat strip of land along the coast, then rises into hill country as you travel east. The cities that Joshua is supposed to have conquered, but apparently didn't, were cities of the plain. But never mind. According to the book of Judges, the Israelite invaders from Egypt were up in the hill country. Although the map of the biblical kingdom may have been the inspiration for modern Israel, the state created in 1948 did not include the hill country. But Israel took over that land in the War of 1967, and Israeli archaeologists made startling new discoveries there, not by digging, but by surveying the land.
I was an officer in the Israeli army, and I was injured near the Suez Canal, and I was more than a year in a hospital, and then I recovered on a wheelchair and finally with the crutches. But that, I believe, became kind of a challenge to me.
And it keeps you going?
It keeps me going, and also the curiosity, really, to know if all the Bible, which is so important all over, is it true historically or untrue?
Adam Zertol and his team have been painstakingly surveying the hills of the West Bank every Friday for over 20 years.
Well, the art of surveying, I call it art because it's art and science together. Is to concentrate on the ground and look for the little tiny pieces of pottery or even flint tools. And by that we can locate the period by these little tiny pieces, you know. The way we start, we just spread all over on the territory and raise any little tiny piece of pottery you see.
Adam, look what I found.
Oh, that's a marking on a handle. It's very nice in that.
I actually found it quite hard to tell what was a stone and what a fragment of pottery. But to the expert eye, these fragments can be read like a book.
That's quite a hoard.
Yes, but it is all of it, all this quantity is from the Iron Age. Okay, let's go on, let's explore. There's an architecture appearing here. This is a kind of a wall.
Oh, yeah.
And closer wall, and more pottery. Please come up here, everybody. Come on, everybody. I think we've just discovered the site here.
Fantastic.
Okay, that what you see like a pile of big rocks is a typical enclosure wall surrounding the early Iron Age sites. And that is just been discovered here. The evidence we've found of more than 200 sites is that this area was absolutely empty in the late Canaanite period, which is 14th, 13th century, and it has been filled up with new sites. We can trace a movement from east to west, exactly how the Bible explains the entrance through the Jordan into the hill country of Canaan.
Adam Zertol's survey is part of a revolution in our knowledge of biblical history. One of these new hill country sites has been excavated. The excavator, Israel Finkelstein, took me to see it. He hadn't been back for 20 years.
Do you recognize the site, Israel?
Very difficult. I must sound like an old-timer now, telling you that there was nothing here. This was a hill overlooking the coastal plain. It was very quiet and peaceful, and now, I mean, look around, the buildings and the highway, everywhere. It's unbelievable. Well, this is a village from the period of the rise of early Israel, a village which was inhabited by about 100 people. This is the central building of the village. If you wish, this is the house of the sheikh. The first settlement at the site was some sort of an oval camp. It looked like this. It's about 100 meters across, not more than that. In the middle, there was an open court with a few silos, but no more than that. Now, this kind of settlement, when you have an open court like this, is, I think, a clue that the people had many animals. They were pastoral people, and then they became agriculturalists. Now, when we are looking at societies in the world today, in the Middle East, which still go through this process, we see something very interesting. That when they go through this process, which is a gradual one, they tend, in the first stage of the sedentary agricultural village life, to keep the traditions of the tent encampment of their former pastoral way of life.
In the next stage of the site, this building was erected. This seems to be a new kind of house, a design unknown in the country before these settlements began. And the Israelis consider it so important, they built a reconstruction of it. Perhaps we really have found the first homes of the Israelites. And there's something else new as well.
In the highlands, we see something quite surprising. Pig bones disappear altogether from the archaeological record, which means we have them before, and we'll have them also later. But in that period of time, in the Iron Age, in the time of biblical Israel, if you wish, they disappear. At the same time, in the lowlands, not only that we have bones, pig bones, we have a lot of them.
Jewish law forbids eating animals which are not kosher, most specifically pigs. It's okay, they're not religious police. It is surprising to see echoes of a kosher diet in these settlements, which suddenly appeared when the Bible says the Israelites arrived from Egypt.
I think because we have pig bones before and later, there's no way but to say that these people took a decision not to take out pork from their kitchen.
So these were the ancient Israelites coming with their flocks of sheep and goats from Egypt?
Well, not at all. They were what? They were probably Canaanites.
Ouch. Just when I was sure we had found the biblical Israelites, I'm told no. People in these new settlements had come not as slaves from Egypt, but had moved here from other places in Canaan. Their pottery is Canaanite. The Israelites seem to have disappeared completely.
It's odd. Even when things on the ground, destroyed cities, people who don't eat pork, seem to fit with what the Bible says, the experts say that that's just a coincidence. What people have been telling me is that the Bible's history of the 12th century BC was actually written down hundreds of years later.
In a sense, to ask the archaeological questions behind them is a bit like trying to read Shakespeare's Julius Caesar and writing a book about the history of the Roman Empire. It's a later creation using older materials to make a certain point. And therefore, how you go from that to the real history and the archaeological evidence is very difficult.
There is a contemporary record of a military force entering Canaan from Egypt. It's not a force of Israelites led by Moses and Joshua. It's a force of Egyptians led by Pharaoh. Egypt ruled Canaan, and Ramesses II's successor, Menapta, crushed disobedience in Canaan around 1207 BC. He was very thorough.
Canaan is plundered with every evil. Ashkelon is stripped. Gaza is seized.
So what about the Israelites? Were there any? You bet there were. They were already living in Canaan.
The Israelites are laid waste. Their seed is gone.
And this broken fragment is the only picture that exists of ancient Israelites. Not humiliating Pharaoh and conquering Canaan, but being crushed beneath the hooves of Egyptian horses. So there really were Israelites, but we seem to know nothing at all about them. Who were they?
Perhaps the Bible is a work of fiction. According to an Egyptian pharaoh in about 1200 BCE, There were people living in these hills called Israelites. It was the first time they'd been mentioned, and he said he wiped them out. Apart from what it says in the Bible, they're not mentioned again by anyone for the next 350 years. Where did these people come from? What's their origin?
Well, first of all, they were indigenous to this country. We are not speaking about people who come from outside.
The Canaanites' chief god was called El, and Israel is a Canaanite word meaning El fighter. Perhaps they were Canaanite patriots who had taken to the hills and not foreign invaders.
So to sum up, the people who came to live in this hill country were Canaanites. They came up into this hill country area. We've no idea of what their religion was. Presumably they were pagans. There was no conquest.
Yes, basically this is the story.
But is there any real proof that the Israelites were actually native-born Canaanites, rather than escaped slaves from Egypt?
I was wondering whether you found human bones in your excavations. It occurs to me that with modern DNA testing, you could make a clear identification of the ancient Israelites.
Yeah, interestingly enough, there's no human bones. In the early Israelite sites, no cemeteries and no human bones has ever been found. That's one of the biggest mysteries of biblical archaeology. Why no human bones of early Israelite time?
Further research revealed that this is not quite true. But we can't reveal our informant.
Well, the bones were there. We have an awful lot of skeletal material from that period here in Israel. If there is anybody today who is carrying out this research, I'm positive that they are not willing to speak about it publicly.
Why would that be?
Over the years, the archaeological community has suffered tremendously because of religious fanaticism.
Disgusting, disgraceful archaeologists. Rot, your bones should rot. Your family should rot. Your kids should get cancer and drop dead because you are doing disgraceful things to our forefathers.
Anyone who disturbs the bones of the dead is immediately marked out as a target. It may be too dangerous to touch the bones of the dead, but the blood of the ancient Israelites and Canaanites ought still to run in the veins of the living, and they can be examined. At Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, they are investigating whether today's Jews and Palestinians might both be descended from one group of people.
Every male has the Y chromosome of his father, his grandfather, great-grandfather, along all the generations. Our research has focused on the Arabs who live in this area, the Israeli and Palestinian Arabs, and we try to see what is the relationship to the Jews.
They found that Arabs descend from a single ancestral chromosome on their father's side, but that the line of descent is broken in some places. Then they looked at Jewish DNA, and there they found the lines of paternal descent that neatly filled in the gaps in the Arabs' heritage.
So basically the two populations that have originated in the Middle East are fit together. There are, if you like, deep ancestral links between them.
Yeah, that's very clear from our research, that they all fit very closely together. We never suspected that the genetic affinity is so close between these two populations.
Palestinian Arabs see themselves as directly descended from the biblical Canaanites. This discovery that they share a genetic heritage with modern Jews seems to connect with the idea that Israelites and Canaanites were the same people. Some Palestinians say that that makes them the true inheritors of any Israelite claim to the land.
Khaled, looking out over this landscape, it's like the pictures I had in my Bible as a child. One has a feeling that perhaps nothing has changed over thousands of years.
If you want to understand the Old Testament or the old scriptures, you have to study the daily life of the Palestinians. Here you have some pots, 2 pots. This one is modern. This is produced by Muhammad Yunus, the potter here in Jabba. And this one is dated 900 BC, from the so-called, if you want, Israelite period. This tradition has continued over the years. If you want to consider Israelites as Canaanites, it's fine with me, you know, but for me, all of this is Palestinian tradition.
So, Israelites and Canaanites have become interchangeable, but only so long as there is no hard evidence outside the Bible itself that the Israelites did invade the land. And that brings me to a very strange sight indeed.
So we came here after surveying Mount Ebal for about 2 months. It's a huge mountain of about 18 square kilometers. And then we came one sunny day in April to that site here with a barren place of rocks and stones, in the middle of which we found this pile of stones, big pile of stones. But what was very attractive to us that we found here many potsherds of the beginning of Israelite settlement, time of Moses and Joshua. So we began to uncover this pile of stones that was a kind of a mystery. We did not know what there is there, but we could see some walls emerging from that pile of stone. Now, what we found was a very complicated structure of large unhewn stones, which is very important.
Unhewn, yeah?
Unhewn stones with kind of installations full of ashes with bones.
Then Joshua built an altar to Yahweh, the God of Israel, on Mount Ebal, an altar of whole stones over which no man hath lifted up any iron. And they offered thereon burnt offerings to Yahweh, and sacrificed peace offerings. And he wrote there upon the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he wrote in the presence of the children of Israel.
When we sent those bones to the university at Jerusalem for check, they were very surprised because all the bones belonged to kosher animals, which appear on the Bible, in the early Bible, as permitted for sacrifice.
So presumably no pig bones?
No pig bones, no donkeys, no things like, no camels, no things like this, only kosher animals. And surprisingly enough, also, they were all burned. So, which means, of course, sacrifice.
Is it always as windy as this up here?
Yes, very windy.
Oh my God.
We deal here with an altar, a big altar with kosher animals and sacrifices and whatever. And then when we came to the book of Joshua, we have here a detailed description of a very great ceremony where all the Israel were present. And this is more or less what we found here.
Has it changed your view of the Bible as being a collection of myths into something more real and positive history?
As a scientist, as a rationalist, as an archaeologist, I refuse to accept the fact. It was very hard to me. So finally I had to surrender. And I think it somehow freed me, liberated me from that preconception that the Bible, the early Bible, is all mythology, all collection of legends.
Other scholars are uncomfortable with this identification of Joshua's altar. The problem isn't with this site, but with the story. In the 620s BC, King Josiah wanted to reform worship in Jerusalem, and it looks as though the Book of Joshua was produced at this time.
Apparently this same circle of scribes and teachers who supported Josiah and his reform decided that this was also the time to survey the entire history of the life of the Israelites in the land, from Joshua through Josiah.
They also said that they had found a scroll of God's teaching. This seems to have been the Book of Deuteronomy. It was evidently unknown until they produced it. According to the prophet Jeremiah, they were faking history.
Why do you say we have the law of Yahweh? Look at it. It's a pack of lies from the lying pen of scribes.
Moses' instructions to build the altar and what to do there are in the Book of Deuteronomy, which scholars don't think was written until 600 years after Joshua's day.
The early part of Joshua describes Joshua as loyal to the book of Deuteronomy, which is a book that really in his day wasn't even around.
But does that mean it never happened? Amnon Ben-Tor, excavating at Hatzor, is convinced that the authors of the Bible used historical records.
Even if we think that everything was written down in the 7th century, which it wasn't, these people were not just writing fiction. They had data in their hands.
Thousands of ancient letters and financial records have been found in the Near East, written in a script called cuneiform. Some of them mention a ruler of Hatzor called Yavin, the name of the king of Hatzor in the book of Joshua.
Yavin is a very strange name. Nobody, it doesn't appear again. How could they know? There was only one such person here at Hatzor, and we know because he's mentioned in an archive in cuneiform. How did they know such a name?
They knew that there was a king Yavin at Hatzor, but they evidently did not know that he cannot have been Joshua's enemy because he died 500 years earlier. That story can't be true. And that may also apply to the biggest story of all. Jerusalem is supposed to have become the capital city of David around 1000 BC. So why are archaeologists saying there is no trace of that city?
The law of God. Look at it. It's a pack of lies from the lying pen of scribes. Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8.
What a view! The Western Wall, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Dome of the Rock, the old city of Jerusalem, a key focus for three great religions. The Israelis captured it in 1967, and because of its symbolic value as the old capital of Kings David and Solomon, incorporated it into their modern capital. That caused the continuing anger and enmity of the Arabs. After the death of Solomon, the Bible says, Israel divided into two kingdoms. But the time when David took over Jerusalem and Solomon built the temple, the 10th century, is called the United Monarchy, when Jerusalem was the glorious capital of all Israel. Solomon's temple is long gone, but was never to be forgotten. It stood on the mountain where Abraham was going to sacrifice his son. Many faiths hold Jerusalem sacred. Now, some scholars say that Solomon never existed and that Jerusalem was never the capital of the Kingdom of Israel.
We really don't have archaeological evidence for a united monarchy under David and Solomon in the way that it's depicted in the Bible.
There's almost no evidence for the 10th century. There's almost no evidence for Solomon. So Jerusalem was probably a very poor village or a very small town.
If you look at all the excavations that have gone on in Jerusalem for over 100 years, a very heavily excavated site, you can barely find a handful or two of sherds that you can date to the 10th century, that is to the so-called Solomonic period. Based on this evidence, it seems like there wasn't a city here. However, to speak about evidence, the absence of evidence as proof, is ridiculous. There are current excavations in Jerusalem, and I don't think I'm misquoting the excavator if I say that in all of his excavations, he has never found, even in his dumps, digging down from the top to the bottom, he has never found one Byzantine sherd. Now we know that Jerusalem was a big city in the Byzantine period. Because he has not found any Byzantine evidence in his excavation, does that mean there wasn't a Byzantine city?
Obviously not. But then there's a Byzantine mosaic map of the city about 40 miles away. The problem with David's Jerusalem is that there is no reference to it anywhere at all outside the Bible. There is only one single reference to the Israelites known in Egypt. It's a record of how the pharaoh Merneptah crushed all opposition in other lands. It's generally dated about 1200 BC, around the time when the Israelites should have been conquering Canaan.
The people of Israel are laid waste. They are childless. Palestine has become a widow for Egypt.
If we had no Bible, we would assume that Merneptah had attacked some odd folk in Canaan called the people of Israel, worshippers of El, who was the Canaanites' chief god, and wiped them out. And we don't find the word Israel mentioned anywhere for the next 350 years. The story in the Bible is totally different, of course. Instead of saying that the Israelites were destroyed by Pharaoh, the Bible says that they took over the land and created a great kingdom ruled by King David from Jerusalem. If you go looking for David in Jerusalem, you find a lot. He's everywhere. This is his city, the city of David, Zion. It gave its name to Zionism, a political movement that created modern Israel. The city of David is a ridge of mountain some 200 yards by 600. This part of Jerusalem was under Arab rule until 1967. Today, there's a Zionist settlement here.
We're standing on the actual grounds where the palace of King David once stood. Essentially, the city of Jerusalem during the biblical period of time was a teeny little mountain, circled by massive mountains all around it. Stretching south of here, with right above us in the north, is Temple Mount, where the Holy Temple once stood.
I mean, is there a political element to actually being here in this important site, obviously for Jews and the history of Israel, but it's also taking land away from the Arabs? I mean, are you protecting in some way Temple Mount?
Well, I would say yes. You need to understand that the fact that Temple Mount stands here and that this is the corridor of access to Temple Mount plays a major significance in terms of the future plans of some kind of a political settlement here. But the greater emphasis is more of the historical, archaeological importance of life here.
The archaeology and the politics go together. These Jewish settlers are funding excavation by the Israeli Department of Antiquities into the ground under their feet, looking for the proof that David and Solomon ruled Israel from Mount Zion.
Why is it important that you should plan whenever you can afford to, or whatever it suits, to dig down, to find the palace?
I could comfortably look down at the city and see the boundaries of the city of Jerusalem from the perspective of King David. I could imagine him sitting in his palace writing the book of Psalm, understanding the passages that he's describing. But there's so much that we don't understand in terms of how the city functioned and how the people lived here, that every time we put a shovel in the ground here and lift it up, more evidence come forth. More passages of the Bible come to life.
Perhaps this 8th century BC toilet seat illustrates the second book of Kings, chapter 18, verse 27. Look it up later. It was in a house built into this much older, massive structure, presumably the fortress referred to in the Bible.
David took the fortress of Zion. David dwelt in the fortress and called it the city of David. And David built round about.
The fortress seems to date from about 200 years before David, so it was there at the time, and there were a few fragments of pottery from his day found in the structure, but no trace of David's city. The only new buildings discovered were from the 8th century, 200 years after David. The settlers are waiting for the new excavations to supplement these fragments with positive evidence of the Israelites in Jerusalem in the 10th century.
Well, you see, we are now outside the city of David. The city of David is there. We are just at the city wall, outside, and we cannot climb into it. The question is only, in what period of time is this city wall protecting the city of David?
So could this be built by David or Solomon, or there were...
Well, it cannot, because our excavation on the top of the wall and behind the wall, inside the city, produced only pottery from a couple of centuries after David and Solomon, from the 8th century BC.
Right.
That's the problem throughout the city. The Bible says that around 1000 BC, King David captured Jerusalem. According to the book of Samuel, his troops got in through a gutter or water pipe.
This is amazing, Ronnie. What is this place?
We are underground in a tunnel cut by men. We are now going to the spring to draw water. Secretly, this was cut by men in the 18th century BC by the Canaanites.
So this was approximately 800 years here already, before the time supposedly that King David conquered the city.
Yes. If we go by the pottery, and this is our only way to know, then we don't have not a single sherd near the spring, and in the vicinity, close vicinity of the spring, we don't have a single sherd until now in the excavation dating to the 10th century BC. So that is the days of David. We don't have. Right. So we have here a confrontation between text and archaeological finds.
The Jewish settlers who are sponsoring your work here, Ronnie, you haven't really found the city of David for them. How pleased are they with your work?
Well, we didn't look for them for a city of David or for the footprints of King David. We are excavating whatever is here. I know that we have a problem. I mean, the archaeologists and the Bible scholars have a problem on the presence of Israelites. We have only from the Canaanites of the 18th century, and we have of the Israelite of the 8th century, a millennium later. But in between, we don't have. Nobody has broken in the 10th century a bucket or a cooking jar or anything made of pottery, which is very difficult to accept because people in ancient times broke pottery in huge quantities, and if we don't have the 10th century, then it means that nobody in the 10th century was near the spring.
This is bewildering. The Christian story says that Jesus was a descendant of David. This is the city where David and Solomon ruled 3,000 years ago. No trace of an Israelite presence? No David? No holy city?
In memory of Major General Shlomo Goren, first Chief Rabbi of the Israel Defense Forces and Chief Rabbi of Israel, leader of the liberators of the Temple Mount and Western Wall. The story of the ancient Israelites conquering the land as the chosen people of the only God may not be true. But when the Israelis conquered Jerusalem in 1967, in the name of that story, soldiers who'd never shown any interest in their religion before broke down and wept as they reached the Western Wall.
This is a symbolic site, but some scholars insist that there was no Judaic city here until the 9th century BC, when it was in Judah. It was not in Israel at all. When they say that, it has a real political significance, whether they know it or not.
If we concentrate on the question of when it became the capital of Israel, it never was.
So really, Jerusalem first became the capital of a state called Israel in 1967. Is that fair enough to say?
Oh.
So do you see what I mean?
Yes, this is the first time that the older city of Jerusalem becomes associated with a state called Israel.
That kind of statement is, not surprisingly, seen as very dangerous by Zionists.
I don't think that they are actually trying to threaten the existence of the state. They are supplying armament and ammunition to those who want to delegitimize the Israeli state. Archaeology is a big puzzle, and if you say that I haven't found this stone and this stone and this stone, there is still enough left of it to put the picture together.
Archaeologists often say that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because they can't find evidence of King David's capital at Jerusalem doesn't mean it wasn't there. Perhaps it's a general problem. Perhaps it's hard to find evidence of anyone from this distant time. So I checked. David's people are missing. What about Goliaths? A few years after Pharaoh Menaptah said he had wiped out the Israelites, his successor, Ramesses III, had to deal with a massive invasion of people from the sea. Among them were the Philistines. They ended up settling on the Canaanite coast. Larry Steger is digging at one of them, Ashkelon. And oddly, he has not had the same problem. We're looking for Philistines. Here they are.
We're right down on the coast, and here it's a completely different world. This is a cosmopolitan world, whereas they're a village, agrarian kind of world. We have new elements that have never been seen before.
If you went entirely by the finds, you would have to say that in the days of the United Monarchy, Jerusalem was nothing much at all, but Ashkelon was a thriving city.
The Philistines were actually related to the Greeks. We have painted pottery that goes back to Greek Mycenaean prototypes. We also find in Cyprus and here, and some parts of the Greek world, scapula, the shoulder blade of a cow that's been incised. And maybe it'll have 20 or 40 incisions on it, and it will be used as a musical instrument. Again, that's something that we find among the Philistines, but not in the surrounding cultures.
This discovery that the Philistines come out of the world of the ancient Greeks, the world described by Homer, makes sense of some things in the Bible that had seemed baffling.
If you look at the story of Goliath and David, David, of course, is not dressed in armor, doesn't have a helmet. Goliath does. We know that the Canaanites and the Israelites didn't have helmets, but the Greeks did. Goliath is essentially a Mycenaean warrior, and he wears something that a Canaanite or an Israelite would never wear. He has shin guards or greaves, and so these are in metal.
Does that sound true? Would he have appeared like that?
We have the warrior vase from Mycenae, and those warriors wear the helmets and they have shin guards. So there's no way that someone could come up with as many accurate ideas about them as we have in the Bible and not have had some sources that were reliable. We actually learned one thing from these excavations that we hadn't thought before. Most people had the idea that the Philistines, as we use the term today, were rather loutish, boorish people.
Yeah.
We're finding that they're quite sophisticated urbanites
Right.
with a cosmopolitan culture. And in the distance is a large chalk basin.
Oh, yes,
which was used as a bathtub. Now, bathtubs are known from the Mycenaean world, from Cyprus, but never from this area until the Philistines arrived.
Thinking of the biblical figure of Goliath, he's an absolute giant. This bathtub that you found this season doesn't look too big. Can I just see what it's like for size?
Sure.
Get a sense of it. Because I'm a small fella, so I don't really reckon that.
Well,
mind you,
it
would be all right.
Not bad.
Not bad. Rather more sort of for a figure like David, who's going to be a little guy.
I think more like Delilah.
I'm getting rather impressed with these Philistine people, you know. Sitting out in the sun having a bath, you're perfect. It's certainly a beautiful location for having an archaeological lesson, Larry. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. And we can fill the tub now.
Ah, time to go, I think. Thank you.
We may know nothing of life in 10th century Jerusalem, but there's so much Philistine evidence, we can even try their cooking.
Well, you see, John, this cooking pot, Philistine cooking pot, we actually call it cooking jug because it has one handle and you can pour whatever in it out. It has a flat bottom, what we call a ring base.
Right.
This is very different from the Canaanite cooking pot. You see, John, this is a Canaanite cooking pot.
Sure,
of course, it is reconstructed from all these little pieces that have been found at the site. But the end result is a typical cooking pot of this period, the period of the Philistines. And you can see that it has a very open mouth.
Completely different from the Philistine one.
Round bottom.
Well, can we give it a go? See if we can work out how the Philistines did cook a meal in the pot.
Let's try.
Though, to be honest, I'm not sure we're going to want to try it, but we'll see. Right. It's very, very hot.
You see, the pot is put into the fire is very different from the Canaanite way because
Right.
it's buried within the ashes. Such jugs that we saw before were never been used here in Israel before the Philistines came here.
If only there was some such distinctive evidence of Israelites at Jerusalem, or indeed anywhere.
Well, something's been happening. It's bubbling in there, but it looks rather ominously green. Do you want to just... Is that too hot to handle?
Not terribly so.
Oh, that looks...
And
if you just hold it.
yes, do you want some of the meat?
Should we just try the soup first to see how we're getting on? Do you want the privilege? The honour? Yeah, after all, it's your archaeology.
Yes.
I'm not being a coward, honestly. It'll probably need quite a bit of salt, I think.
You should try it. It's
Is
a
it good?
delicious soup.
It is. The more detail is discovered about the Philistines, the more accurate the Old Testament seems about them. It even names the Philistine site where we are cooking, Ekron, and the name was found on an inscription here. But the Bible describes Philistines as always being in the region, when in fact they were new invaders. Around 1200 BC, the time of the Trojan War, the whole of the eastern Mediterranean was in chaos. Whole peoples were on the move, and the Egyptians found themselves under attack from people from the sea. The Philistine settlement on the coast of Canaan was part of this invasion. Up to then, Ashkelon had been a Canaanite city.
Somewhere between 1200 and 1150, these Philistines moved in. But it's a new culture that's imposed on the old one. Sometimes they actually burnt down these earlier Canaanite cities.
Right.
In fact, many scholars have suggested that the Israelites were Canaanite refugees, pastoralists, sheep and goat herders, farming in the hills because of the upheaval on the lush plains.
Now, in the big change, in the collapse, there is no doubt that there were economic difficulties that forced the pastoral groups to settle down and produce their own grain. So I see the rise of early Israel as part of the bigger picture of the events that took place in the Eastern Mediterranean.
This argument is based on what is found in the simple hill country settlements that seem to be the earliest Israelite sites. The pottery in Israelite houses is Canaanite. The cooking pots in their distinctive four-roomed houses are wide-mouthed and round-bottomed, designed for Canaanite cookery. But in Jerusalem, all this is missing. There really isn't any evidence that anyone was cooking anything there in the 10th century, which led some scholars to begin arguing that large parts of the Israelite story were entirely mythical, including the very existence of King David. Until 1993, when veteran Israeli archaeologist Avraham Baran was excavating Tel Dan, the old city of Dan in the far north of Israel.
Our surveyor was mapping the walls that are here. I mean, you have to have maps before you finish. And as we were walking by here, suddenly she yells and says, "I think we have an inscription."
My word.
So I walked over and I looked down, and yes, indeed.
And this is it.
The rays of the sun were illuminating this basalt stone, and the letters were clear, and I said, "You see the word Melech, king."
Yeah.
And Melech, Beit David, king of the house of David. See, in the first place, one doesn't find inscriptions. In the second place, one doesn't find an inscription with the name David on it. And here you have an inscription written about 100 years after David's time. Well, I tell you, there are biblical scholars who maintain that there was no united monarchy. There was no David, no Solomon. This discovery upset all their theories. And they had to argue with that discovery. Somebody went as far as saying this was a fake.
Most scholars now accept there really was a King David after all. But king of what exactly? The challenge to biblical history remains.
I think if David had been an important king, he would have turned up somewhere in contemporary historical documents. Assyrian texts texts, texts from Anatolia, I mean, wherever, Egyptian texts, if he was such a big figure, he would surely have turned up.
And his successor, Solomon, should have been an even bigger figure. So now I'm going looking for Solomon. It's not easy, because wherever you look for him, you seem to find someone else.
The law of God. Look at it. It's a pack of lies from the lying pen of scribes. Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8.
As a hostage in Beirut, I was a victim of an ancient conflict. In captivity, I read the Bible through twice. The battles fought there over the rights to the ownership of the land of Israel had a distinct relevance for me. But I've been discovering, making this series, that the past itself is actually a battlefield.
So far, I've been told that despite what it says in the Bible, the evidence indicates that the Israelites did not come from Egypt and conquer Canaan, that they emerged from the local population, and that there is no trace of a city in Jerusalem in the days of David and Solomon.
The reason why some people don't accept that there was a Solomonic city in Jerusalem in the 10th century is because it's in the Bible. The Bible is suspect.
Jerusalem was probably a very poor village.
For many Israelis, the Hebrew Bible is the constitution of the modern state, and to question that, it's questioning Israel's right to exist.
Jerusalem, where there's almost no evidence for the 10th century.
To speak about evidence, the absence of evidence, as proof is ridiculous.
Don't use the Bible. Leave the Bible at home, please. You can come back to it later.
If you work without the Bible, all you're left with is dry bones and pots and pans. Who wants it?
The row over what is and is not true in the Bible can really wreck people's lives. That's why I've come here to King Solomon's mines. So here we are at King Solomon's mines.
May I correct you? You are at mines, but there were no King Solomon's mines. Not here and not anywhere else in the region.
The age of King Solomon is recorded in the Bible as the one time when an Israelite king ruled the whole land and it was at peace.
He had peace on all sides round about him. And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, all the days of Solomon.
Benno Rothenberg began the process of undermining the myths when he excavated Timnah at the southern tip of Israel. The mines here were supposed to give Solomon his fabulous wealth.
And of course, King Solomon's mines is a wonderful story. You look at a shrine or a temple built by the Egyptian mining expeditions. This is not 10th century, this means Solomonic. This is 13th, 12th century. late bronze pottery. And then that's where my trouble started, because I was then saying, directly and indirectly, that there is no King Solomon in the area. There was a conference in Eilat in 1962 all the archaeologists were there, and I was not allowed to lecture.
The odd thing is that King Solomon's mines don't even appear in the Bible. They're just a 19th century story. But this was seen as an attack on King Solomon himself, and Rothenberg was silenced by the establishment.
It was against the biblical archaeology concept. And then they hated me because I was successful, because I could prove by thousands of material finds in the temple, including inscriptions. There was no argument about it, because the king's name, and they were dated long before King Solomon, hundreds of years before Solomon. I had actually to leave Israel universities and go abroad because of this impossible personal situation.
But the climate has changed, and Benno Rothenberg is back in Israel. It's King Solomon who's on the defensive now.
We have no evidence at all for Solomon and his kingdom. We have no textual sources which mention Solomon, contemporary textual sources which mention Solomon, and as far as I'm aware, he's not referred to in any other outside contemporary texts.
This is Megiddo, a city said in the Bible to have been rebuilt by Solomon. When these structures were excavated in the 1930s, they were identified as King Solomon's stables.
Well, in the first instance, they probably weren't Solomon's. And the second instance, they probably weren't stables.
Ah, because we have what seem to be troughs here. What do you reckon they were?
Well, we have problems with these stables. There's no drainage under them. There's no way to bring the requisite hay, the requisite water up for the horses without an intense investment of labor. And most of the troughs are incomplete. They're broken on the ends. They have channels cut through them. This particular trough even has weights associated with it.
Right. So how can a clever archaeologist explain this site?
Not a single horse bone has come out of this site so far. So what we're looking for is some sort of viscous liquid that would not leak out of the broken troughs.
Right.
Presumably something that needed to be pressed into patties, something that could be processed in one of these troughs and cut into perhaps cakes, removed for export without clay vessels. Something on the order of opium comes to mind to me.
So the ancient Israelite kings, if they were Israelites, were basically drug runners, you reckon?
That's my wish fulfillment scenario, yeah. I really hope that that's the case. But we do have evidence for the export of drugs from this area during the heyday of the Assyrian Empire, so that it's not entirely fantasy.
There were certainly poppies in the area. They are shown on later Jewish coins.
If it wasn't Solomon, who was it then? Who built this?
Well, this particular unit, these stables, come from a period that is generally assigned to the 9th century BC, contemporary with Ahab, more or less.
I happened to be at another excavation the next day, the ancient city of Hatzor, when they discovered something very surprising, at a level of the same date as those stone troughs.
See, that's a nice one. It's a pity it's here. I'm gonna look. I think we only have found one of these in all of the years of Hatzor. But this is more beautiful, but we will not clean it now. We'll take it outside.
Could it possibly be a pipe? According to the Bible, King Solomon rebuilt 3 cities, Gezer, Hatzor, and Megiddo. In the 1950s, an Israeli archaeologist found these complex gatehouses in all 3 and announced they were King Solomon's gates. This is the one at Hatzor. And this at Megiddo. But King Solomon is having this gate confiscated.
So, David, this is the King Solomon's Gate, as it's called, here at Megiddo. Is it really his gate?
There is a problem here, because the gate is connected and built together with a city wall, which is later in date and dates to the later period of the Israelite monarchy, to the end of the 9th or even the 8th century BC, much later than Solomon. The gate was built together with the wall, and this is quite clear, and therefore the gate is later. And I feel that King Solomon probably turns in his grave whenever he listens that the gate is ascribed to him.
Oh well, he's lost his stables and he's lost his gate, but at least he still has his palace here.
Well, this is a palace, in fact, which is quite a big one. It's about 30 meters long and 20 meters wide, which is kind of a large building.
Yeah.
And it was excavated, part of it was excavated by Iga Eliadin in the 60s.
Right.
And he identified it as a palace, rightly so. And he also dated it to the time of Solomon.
Aha. Was he right?
Well, the way I understand it, it was built in the 9th century, in the beginning of the 9th century, at the time of the northern kingdom of Israel, when the northern kingdom was ruled from Samaria, probably in the time of King Ahab.
Ahab again. He's the king of the stables. Sorry, opium factory. King of the gates and king of the palace. So who is King Ahab? According to the Bible, Solomon was a very special king.
The Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream, and God said, "Ask what I shall give thee."
Solomon asked for the power of judgment. The judgment of Solomon is legendary. He could tell the true mother of a baby by ordering it to be cut in two. The baby remained whole. It was his kingdom that was split in two. Good judge, bad ruler. The moment he died, the kingdom split. About 50 years later, Ahab became the ruler of the northern kingdom, called Israel or Samaria. And if what Finkelstein and Ussishkin say is true, Solomon's empire, ruled from Jerusalem in the 10th century BC, turns into a fable, a fantasy. The massive stone blocks were put there for Ahab and his father Omri. In Solomon's day, according to Israel Finkelstein, the king of Megiddo made do with mud bricks and big pebbles.
Yes, indeed, this city is a city from the period of David and Solomon. However, as far as I can understand it, it's not a city of David and Solomon.
Okay.
We are here in the last breath of the Canaanite world. We don't really have states here. In the 10th century, although it's always possible to argue that there was one state, you know, centered in Jerusalem and so on, it's kind of difficult.
Of course, Solomon's kingdom would not be in doubt if there was evidence of his palace and his temple in Jerusalem, but there isn't.
We have not a stone of Solomon's temple. We have the descriptions of Solomon's temple, but we have not a stone of it.
Solomon's temple should have been the heart of his kingdom, but it can't even be looked for. If there are any remains buried under the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that's exactly where they'll stay. What exactly convinced some archaeologists that the fine buildings that had been thought to be Solomon's really belonged to a later period? The answer is pottery. Up until 1990, it was believed that if you found this kind of pottery on a site, you were looking at something made in the days of King Solomon. Why? Well, mainly, apparently, because it was found in the remains of buildings which everyone thought were built by Solomon. But in 1990, David Ussishkin began to excavate at Tel Yisrael, a few miles from Megiddo, the summer palace of Ahab and his wife.
Jezreel was the main fortified main fort of King Omri and King Ahab. It was obviously their main military center, and one can see that it's built on a very dominating position, dominating the main road and the valley of Jezreel.
These are the first Israelite kings whose names appear outside the Bible. Omri and his son Ahab are named as oppressors of the Moabites on this inscription, and Ahab is listed as one of the Assyrians' most powerful enemies. They're not as famous as Solomon, but you might have heard of Ahab's wife, Jezebel. She brought disaster on everyone, and in the process, it turns out, she provided the evidence that has so damaged Solomon. These children from Israel are hearing the Bible story of what Jezebel did to Naboth. He had a vineyard next to the palace. Ahab wanted the vineyard, Naboth wouldn't sell it. So to cheer up her husband, Jezebel had Naboth executed on false charges, and the king was given his property. Not a nice person. There's no vineyard to be seen now, but there is evidence that there really were vines next to the palace.
When archaeologists excavated the site, they found here in this cave containers for wine, old wine vessels. And the theory is that behind me here they pressed the grapes, the wine ran down across these stones, they collected the wine and then stored it in there.
The Bible records a sense of outrage. About a month later, Ahab was killed in battle, and soon after that, Jezreel was destroyed, along with Jezebel. The Assyrian ruler Shalmaneser III does record defeating Ahab in battle, though he didn't mention that he was doing it as Naboth's avenger. Jezebel may have been a bad thing from some points of view, but she performed a great service for archaeology. She brought about the destruction of Jezreel at a known date, so its pottery can be dated. No wonder the excavator is her greatest fan.
I'm always saying jokingly to my wife that a woman who is willing to murder because she sees her husband is in bad mood is an exemplary lady and should be followed.
The destruction that befell her, and therefore the pottery finds at the dig, could be accurately dated. Sam Moorhead was in charge of recording the finds.
The pottery that we found at Jezreel on the floors of the site can be dated quite closely to the destruction of the site, to the 840s.
Right.
The significance is it's the same pottery that was supposed to have been Solomonic at Megiddo.
Across the plain of Jezreel, 10 miles away, is the mound that is Tel Megiddo. The message being sent there was dynamite. They had found pottery from the century after Solomon, and it was the same as the pottery from the great palace at Megiddo. So that palace was not from the age of Solomon. There had been no mighty Israelite empire in the 10th century. Many people disagree very strongly. The distance between Solomon and Ahab is only 100 years. They don't accept that a certain kind of pottery used in the reign of one king was not used under the other.
I believe that this pottery has a long life, that it started in the 10th century and continued into the 9th century. What is the difference between the 10th century and the 9th century? I mean, 10th century and 9th century are just numbers, and the people at the year 900 BC, I mean, 1st of January 900 BC, they didn't realize that they are moving from the 10th to the 9th.
But where's the evidence? Can Mazar find that sort of pottery in a site that unquestionably dates from the time of Solomon? He's searching a few miles from Megiddo at Tel Rehof.
So what have we got here?
Well, for example, you can see here, this is one of 6 goblets, or we call them chalices. They were found today along the walls, and we just washed it. It's before even restoration. You can see, for example, that this piece fits. I'm not a good restorer, I must say. Where does it come? Oh, here, you see? This is the foot, and it will be a nice goblet. We have all the pieces. We shall complete it in a few days. There is a leg here, a foot, and we found 6 of them along a wall. And this is a typical vessel to this time of the 10th and 9th centuries BC.
You can tell if one jar is older than another, but that doesn't give you an actual date. If you find organic material, seeds or wood, with the pottery, that can be scientifically dated, a process called carbon-14 dating.
We found a large heap of grain under brick collapse, so it was a very sealed context. We analyzed this grain in carbon-14 laboratories, 2 different laboratories, and they gave us a date between 900 and 830 BC.
The problem is that carbon-14 dating doesn't give you an exact year. You can just say that it is 98% probable that the date lies in a certain period, and that's what's happened here.
Unfortunately, the span of carbon-14 goes all the way from Solomon to Ahab, exactly this time. So we are in trouble.
Here's the trouble. The bottom part of this room contains the pottery in question. Then the room filled with rubbish, and a new room was built on top.